I want to start out by acknowledging that I think that anyone who's active in feminist politics right now would readily acknowledge that the feminist blogosphere has reached such a state of vitality that major feminist thinking, feminist organizing, and feminist recruiting is happening on feminist blogs. In fact, I think the feminist blogosphere has been functioning this way for a few years now. But I think most recently, the feminist blogosphere has moved into a state of maturity that the mainstream media is paying attention to it, and pundits are responding to it, and feminist organizations are starting to realize how they can work in partnership with the blogosphere. And I think it's really largely because of the strength of the feminist blogosphere that women don't feel like they're shouting in the dark anymore. There's some connection and engagement happening with other spaces that aren't necessarily designated as women's spaces or feminist spaces. In her book on gender in the 2008 election, Rebecca Tracer credits the blogosphere, the feminist blogosphere, with sort of ending the era, the feminist dark ages in the mid to late 90s, where there was just backlash was everywhere, and there really weren't a lot of places for women to express themselves in a feminist way. And I think I'm passionate about the feminist blogosphere for a similar reason, which is that in college I did feminist organizing and had some incredible mentors and peers, but I think it wasn't until I found some of these writers that I experienced women who were writing about feminism in an unapologetic, full-throated way, and had a community of people around them supporting them. So that was an extraordinary thing to find. So I want to launch into who we have on the panel with us. I'll start with Lori, doing this alphabetically, who's a writer, blogger, and advocate for international women's health and rights. She blogs on Akimbo, the IWH, the International Women's Health Coalition blog, and she's also a regular contributor to Feministing and The Griot. And she's also been featured on MSNBC, Jezebel, UN Dispatch, and others. Irin Carmon is a blogger, journalist, and commentator. She's currently at Jezebel, a site published by Gawker Media with 2 million monthly readers. She's also written for the New York Times, Business Week, Fast Company, and others. Andrea Plaid at the end has a distinction of being the first sexual correspondent for Racialicious. Her work on race, gender, sex, and sexuality has appeared at Change.org, Bitch, and Library Journal. She's written lots of other places too, and she also owns an eco-friendly safer sex kit company. Cool. And then finally, Amanda Marcotte is a freelance journalist and blogger who writes regularly for Pentagon, XX, and RH Reality Check, and she's published 2 books. It's a Jungle Out There, The Feminist Survival Guide to Politically Inhospitable Environments, and Get Opinionated, A Progressive's Guide to Finding Your Voice and Taking a Little Action. So with that, I will let you guys talk for a short moment each about your work, and then I will get into questions, and then we'll have a lot of time for audience participation and questions. So, Emily, you want to begin?
Well, when Emily asked us to join this panel, I basically thought that the main thing I should talk about is how long I have been doing this at this point. In internet years, it's roughly, what, 500 years now? I started blogging in 2005 and joined Pentagon in 2006. And back then, there wasn't really a feminist blogosphere per se. It was like me, feminist, Feministing was started, and then Roxanne Cooper had a feminist blog, and we felt like we were kind of it. And periodically back then, there were a lot of male bloggers who would occasionally, that were in all the A-list, high-traffic blogs, and they would occasionally write posts saying, "Where are all the women bloggers?" and then theorize that women are not blogging at all. And we would then write them angry letters. And they would apologize, and then we would go another round, you know, another 3 months, and then they would do it again. Like, where are all the women bloggers? We don't see any women bloggers. I guess women don't like blogging. And it took about 4 or 5 like high-profile fights about that before they began to like actually realize that women were blogging and link us more. And now I feel like it's been tremendous in the years since just watching the feminist blogosphere just explode in size and diversity and influence and like any kind of flavor of feminism you want. You know, there are blogs that specialize in reproductive rights and immigration rights and any kind of like flavor of feminism that you would want to talk about. And I felt like we've changed the way that the dialogue has happened around women and feminism and media. And then I woke up this morning and I read the New York Times article that I heard was discussed earlier today about the Brat Pack and the Juice Box Mafia in Washington, D.C. And I quote from this story. Well, I won't quote it because it's done a number of times, but basically the writer of it just sort of assumes straight up that all of the bloggers that sort of came up and became like actual freelance writers starting off in blogging are dudes, like all white dudes. And I was just like, ah! I felt like we have on one hand come so very far, but then when you read an article like this, it's clear that we have a lot further to go. So I hate to end my speech on a sad note, but
Amanda, they have girlfriends.
They do have girlfriends.
It's just incidental that their girlfriends and fiancés happen to be journalists. But, you know, they're like, who cares?
I guess the most generous reading of this article is that DC runs all female writers out of town, because there were a lot of women in the Juice Box Mafia that I could think of off the top of my head, but I realized all of them moved to New York or somewhere else. So, anyway.
I think I'm going to go last because I'm going to do it.
Oh, okay, sure.
Oh, well, what I do, of course, is we write about race, or racial issues. What else do we do? Race and pop culture specifically. And so even when we talk about feminism and media, we come at from a very different angle, because what we've realized is that that space is not always the friendliest. We have had people who have come from other blogs, we won't say names, and they say, we can't be there. And we come to racial issues as almost as an escape from the ugly comments, from even some of the more clueless coverage. And so we come here to this particular blog because we know that we're going to be challenged, we know that we're going to also have a space where we can talk about these things that we've discovered from other feminist blogs that they don't talk about. They will not talk about race. In fact, the other day I wrote a piece about white female privilege when it came to the Alexandra Wallace case. And of course, we have these women, and a couple people I actually saw on another blog, and they said, well, there's no such thing. There's no such thing. Of course there's no such thing. What are you talking about? And so finally one of our longtime readers, a guy, said, if this was not true, then what the hell was Sojourner Truth talking about? If this was not true, then what was Emmett Till's death? If this was not true, then why are we talking about the difference in media coverage between when white women are missing and are killed and when women of color are missing and are killed? So do not tell us that this does not exist, and frankly, you need to stop. So that's what we do at Racial Issues. It's not that we are not feminists, because a lot of us do believe in it, but we do come at it from a very different angle as far as that's concerned. And we even have some moments of contemplation of whether or not, are we really feminists? What does all this mean when we talk about women of color who are, when we start talking about issues around feminism, and all of a sudden it's, well, that's not really a feminist issue, race, or it's a tacked on issue, or something like that. What are we talking about? So we come from I think we come from a slightly different space when it comes to that issue.
Or you want to? Does it take a little while?
No, we're all queued up.
Oh, okay, that's all right. Okay.
Hi, I'm Lori. Yes, as Emily mentioned, I write for Feministing, I write for The Griot, I write for Akimbo, which is a blog that is hosted by the International Women's Health Coalition, which is sort of where my day job is. So I echo comments that this work really requires sort of, I'm going to use this phrase here that's very charged, but this intersectional approach that really goes beyond the phrase feminism, the word feminism, and gets at sort of like a social justice, rights-based framework. And to that framework, what I tend to sort of always want to be bringing in the transnational aspect because of my work at the International Women's Health Coalition and because Akimbo is a blog that purports to host international women's stories. And so I really feel lucky to be here. The energy in this room is just sort of buzzing, and all of my co-panelists are really, I'm just sort of so impressed by them all the time. And I feel really lucky to be able to do this work because personally, the Feminist Blogosphere had so much to do with my own, I feel, my own personal evolution, my own personal growth, and it still does. And I think consciousness raising is just such an important part of social justice work, and I'm really looking forward to discussing this more with you guys.
Great, thank you. So, Rin, I think you wanted some.
Oh yeah, I was going to say something really quick
Watch out, guys.
beforehand. I think I'm going to stand. Just to quickly introduce what it is that I'm going to show here. But I work at Jezebel. Jezebel is not a feminist blog. It's a blog where many feminists work. And it's an important distinction because we're not like some of the people here. We're not self-employed. We're not a writer-owned collective. We are owned by a guy who's pretty openly not a feminist. But there's a lot of things that, from Anna Holmes, who is our amazing founder, onto some of the work that my colleagues are doing now, we're able to kind of bring a lot of feminist and progressive perspectives to a larger audience. And part of that has to do with our structural demands are such that we're constantly under the gun. Perhaps you've read Gawker Media, we have these bonuses based on how much we grow our traffic. So on the one hand, you have sort of the demands of the internet, which is, viral video, cats, what have you, thinking about ways that you can get people to read things. So for me, as a feminist and as a journalist, I'm trying to think of all of these ways that within this space that is a women's space, but not an explicitly feminist space, how can I make sure that I try to grow that audience as much as possible, at the same time introducing some of the ideas, introducing them to writers, and like the ones in this room, introducing people who might have come for celebrity gossip and now may get a critical perspective on race, now may question the way they think about sexuality and sex work. I would never claim that we're perfect at presenting all these issues at all times, but we are certainly the biggest forum right now that is presenting those issues. So in terms of that, I think it's important to think about reaching people who are sort of beyond that, beyond the people in this room who are really dedicated, and how do we get the people who maybe took a women's studies class or have never heard of women's studies, and how do we get them to come, and how do we get them to read? So I'm just going to quickly show two examples of posts that were small and big, but pretty successful when it comes to, we're measured by unique visitors, so new people that are brought in. This one here was one of the most popular posts on Jezebel last year. We were really lucky that a reader sent in the catalog of the Playboy auction at Christie's. They sent us a link to it, and they noticed that they were auctioning off the original proofs that had these comments on the side that told them how to fix these women. So I hope no one here will be offended if I show some boobs. These are early 90s centerfolds, and basically my boss and I just sat there for an entire afternoon trying to enlarge these. We didn't want to ask for better quality things because we were afraid of getting in rights issues. And just try to say, okay, one of them, this nipple is too pert. There's another, there's a lot of pubic hair fixing. Oh, this is the too pert nipple. That's my bad. All of these women obviously already fit a certain beauty ideal. They already diet. They maybe got some plastic surgery. They've been lit. They've been photographed by professionals, and they're not good enough. This is my favorite. This one, it says better curve to butt. So obviously, it's not enough to be really skinny, have the right kind of curve for butt. So this was a really fun post to do, obviously, but there were a couple of things that made it really, really successful in terms of people passing it around, and one of them is boobs. But on the other hand, that's kind of a problem because not everyone can look at boobs at work. So it ran on a Friday afternoon, kind of blew up by the weekend, and But, you know, it got cross-posted to a lot of the other Gawker media blogs, which are male-dominated, such as Gizmodo and Deadspin. Deadspin will take anything with boobs. Gizmodo will take anything that makes people feel like insiders. You know, so you start to realize people on the internet love primary sources. How can we use that for feminist purposes? People on the internet love feeling like they know something that other people don't know about how this happens. So they can be like, oh, I know all that shit's airbrushed. The other thing is a really kind of different example, and then I will stop taking up so much time. The Center for Reproductive Rights put together an awesome video and a report about the Hyde Amendment. How do I do the Hyde Amendment on a blog next to, you know, Kim Kardashian? And it doesn't necessarily mean, obviously, making this into a Kim Kardashian situation, but you start to realize one thing that works really well on the internet is complete guides to things, even if there's no new information. The report that the Center for Reproductive Rights did had no new information and no new research. It was just kind of like, let's get the Hyde Amendment back on the table. So I just read the entire report, and I turned it into bullet points. I just said, like, here's some interesting stuff. And I really think, and if you look on top, it has 18,000 views, which is really a lot for reproductive rights posts. You know, we can average like 3,000 to 5,000 views for non-heavily trafficked posts. The video is great, but really it's this part. All of these people maybe vaguely know what the Hyde Amendment is, but the ways that these numbers get driven up is people put them on their Facebook. And if it's like, oh my God, I knew that this was kind of a bad thing, but I never realized just how dramatic it is, you know, 69% of women obtaining abortions either poor or low income. Maybe everyone in this room knows that, but once you see it kind of distilled in a field guide. So anyway, just very quickly, those are two examples of ways that we try to create, using these tools of a very mainstream blog to try to get those ideas out there.
Thank you. That was great, and that actually kicks off our next question well, which is I think you began to answer, so I'll focus this to the other three. Is you know, how do you handle the competing demands of audience? You know, working out intra-feminist issues, which are complex and necessary and important, and part of the community building that the Feminist Blogosphere is always engaged in, versus being, you know, understandable to someone who doesn't come with a deep background in this. Do you have a primary aim? Do you think, you know, feminist exams might be different from Pentagon's, or is that, has your own blog evolved, or are you still in a place where you're really trying to attract people, or is it more important to you to be a home for feminists that they don't have elsewhere? Lori, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Well, first of all, I should say I speak for myself and not for anyone else that writes for Feministing, but my experience with Feministing is incredibly personal. I feel like I write about things that I care about as the person that I am, bringing all components of my identity together every day. So the answer, I mean, there are other spaces that I write that I have to be much more targeted about reaching out to certain constituencies, reaching out to people who are already writing or already reading a publication. For example, with the Griot, that's a primarily African-American space. It's African-American news by and for Black folks. So that's like an entirely different target, and I write specifically for those people. But for Feministing, I feel like for the most part, in terms of audience, I write about things that I care about for people who might possibly care about them too. And that's just such a special and rare thing to be able to do. And I think that there are some people who might have said 5, 10, 20 years ago that that's not a political thing, that's not a political blog, that's not a strategic political act. But I think, as you mentioned, the strides that the Feminist Blogosphere has made kind of show that it can be, and the ways that it can be.
So your answer is more that you sort of start from a personal place, and you're not so much thinking about what audience will relate to what. You start with what you're motivated to write about, and then people kind of find ways into that.
It's true, and I think that's also in part because I came to the blog after it had already been established. I'm sort of part of a second wave of writers that have come to a space that was already established as a space for feminist activism and community. So I didn't feel as much of a pressure to establish all of those things and to bring the community myself with my own writing, but rather to engage with it and push it and have it inform me and my ideas, and have me and my ideas inform it.
Andrea, it looked like you were nodding a lot.
Oh, no, because I totally agree. I think the same thing happens with Racialicious. And that's really what the new owner, LaToya, Peterson has basically said is that it is a women of color, femme-centered, people of color-centered space. So whatever we're going to talk about is going to be about not only race, but specifically we're going to talk about, and we're trying to get posts from people of color. That's our goal. That is our aim. This is a home and a safe space where people of color can come and talk about the issues that affect them. And sometimes we do have blowouts where people want to get up and pontificate about this is what I think is correct for this people of color community. And we basically had to say, no, that's not what this is. It's not about pontificating. It's not about you showing off what you know and you think you have your amen corner showing up and agreeing with you. We're making this a space where people can talk about whatever issues, especially around issues around sexuality. Mm-hmm. When we ran our Love Anonymously series, we had some of that happening, and we basically had to say, this is not for you to pontificate about why this person's wrong for liking to give blowjobs. Not the point. This is for people who are people of color who want to find a space where they can talk about giving blowjobs, being people of color. What is it like being a woman of color if your partner is white and you're on your knees and he's standing above you and you're giving him a blowjob? What does that mean? And we are able to use that space to explore that. This is not for you to therefore say, women of color should not be on their knees because that's against the patriarchy, kyriarchy, and all of that. And that's not what it was about. So we've done that, and we try to provide that space as much as we possibly can. So it's like a community. Is how we really see racial issues. Yeah, we do have our points, we do get political, we do get out there, but at the same time, we kind of see it as, it used to be kind of a small village, now it's kind of expanded to like a small city of people, thanks to the many people who do read and the individual people who do read our posts. But we do try to keep it as communal as possible.
If I could just add one thing, yeah, I think that's incredibly true. I think storytelling is incredibly important. And in spaces that are not explicitly feminist, I feel much more personal responsibility to toe the progressive line and make the talking points that I know are the most strategic and maybe the most logically sound about a specific issue. But I don't feel that in the feminist blogosphere it's as important to do that anymore because there's some common ground, right? And you're not facing this necessarily all the time, you're not facing this climate of active hostility or opposition to some basic tenets of ideology and where everybody's at, which makes more room for storytelling, which I think is just a really incredibly important part of activism, part of this work, and especially as someone who works on an internationally involved blog as well, women or people who are working on sexual and reproductive rights and health around the world are really always very appreciative of a space to tell their stories in my experience. So it's even more important when you're thinking about it in the global realm.
Amanda, do you want to answer that question about audience and community and inside and outside?
Well, to build on what Lori and Andrea have said, I think one of the things in my time that has changed a lot is more blogs that are community-oriented spaces have grown in size and popularity, and I feel like that's allowed me to kind of personally go in a different direction with my writing. I used to write, I think, in a much more personal way than I do now. And it depends on the audience that you're trying to, like you said, that you're trying to reach. I've grown a lot less concerned with intra-feminist stuff than I used to be. And my main tactic is just kind of getting more feminism into just general progressive discourse, and I've really been trying to exploit Twitter a lot to do that, and my relationships with people in the kind of larger liberal world. And my main tool for trying to do that is to try and be kind of swift, brief, and funny as much as possible. I think a lot of the time if you can make something funny, you can make somebody understand it a lot faster than if you were trying to be analytical about it. So
Twitter has that discipline.
Yes. Twitter teaches you to be brief. Yeah, when they actually introduced that thing where you could like write a long tweet, I was like, no!
Yeah. What's the point? You don't want people to go on and on.
Yeah. So I started this panel with the position that the kind of attention, the quality of attention, and the volume that the feminist blogosphere gets has changed profoundly in the past like 5 years. And I wonder if you guys think that's true, and what points of pressure you've seen the feminist blogosphere work most effectively, and kind of where you've seen openings to really move out from our community and engage a more mainstream community. I will start that with Irin, because I want to give you the chance to talk about your Daily Show writing.
Sure. I think that's a good example because there were so many different currents to that. Perhaps some of you read a piece that I did over the summer about where I interviewed former writers and producers of the Daily Show about why it had been 9 years since they had hired a woman correspondent, and why all the ones before that had lasted a year, 1 to 2 years. And there was some controversy too about their choice of hire last year, Olivia Munn. Well, she was, after the piece came out, she was giving interviews almost every day because she happened to be promoting a book, calling me a bitch. It was really fun. And she told our readers to take the sandwich out of their mouths and take a walk. So it was really intense because, but no. So this happened basically about a week or two after the piece came out. Women who worked at the Daily Show, most of whom were in back office and support roles, some of whom were producers, wrote an open letter saying, basically saying that my piece was shit, and saying that Jon Stewart is awesome and they love him, and which is, if you read the piece, not really what it's about. It's not about whether Jon Stewart is a nice guy. I quote somebody saying, I don't think Jon Stewart is sexist as much as the comedy world is sexist, but you know how things really get oversimplified on the internet. So a couple of things happened after that open. Oh, and Jon Stewart said on the air that Jezebel thinks I'm a sexist prick, which is its own form of lack of nuance, let's put it that way. And they never really engaged with the issues in the piece. It was really just more like, how dare you call me a sexist? So one of the things that I was disappointed about the way that played out is that I felt like they had refused to give me an interview for the piece. They refused to they'd basically blown me off. They didn't take me seriously. The reason that they felt the need to respond to it is after the piece ran, it was spread around by people that they did care about. They thought, who are you? Who gives a shit? I'll blow you off. The moment that they actually told the New York Times this, the moment that they found out that people were reading it and passing around and saying, oh, let us not leave any progressive heroes unchallenged, let's say, then they felt they had to respond, but they responded in a way that, let's say, was not so conducive to discourse. And but there was a discourse that happened, and the reason that it happened was because of the feminist blogosphere. So this happened, most of these things happened when I was on a plane to Israel, which was a little intense, and it was the day that the open letter came out and the day that Slate ran a piece saying that Jezebel hurts women. And I was halfway out the door about to get on a plane, and so I composed my response on the overnight flight. I was working the next day, and what I found when I got off that plane was that many wonderful, smart people, including some of the people in this room, Sadie Doyle, Amanda Hess, wrote a lot of incredibly thoughtful responses that were not like, rah, rah, go, you were in, go, like, Daily Show sucks, that were really thoughtful examinations of the issues that were brought up by this in good faith. And I felt incredibly grateful to the fact that they had this kind of analysis that, frankly, I was too in it, I had reported on it too much, I felt really supported, and I also felt really challenged because I felt that there was a really thoughtful thing happening, which notably we did not get from the Daily Show. So that got a lot of mainstream attention. The Times did 3 stories in 1 week. He probably added about 90,000 new readers to that story just by that open letter. And so, in the end, I'm happy that, we have more readers and that people came to it. But honestly, in terms of the discourse, I was getting emails from progressive guys, Jon Stewart fans, telling me, how does it feel to be put in your place? That was my favorite one. after the open letter.
How does it feel?
Humble.
Curious.
Progressive guys who were fans of Jon Stewart were sending me emails saying, "I hope your vagina rots out." So to contrast that, stop calling me sexist. You're stupid.
And I hope your vagina rots out.
I'm not
To
sexist.
contrast that with suddenly feeling this incredible community of thoughtful conversation about what are the factors that lead to any workplace that excludes people. I felt like this was a good example in what happens when a dialogue gets very big and what happens when you feel like people kind of have your back and are going to listen, and they may not agree with you about everything, but they're going to engage the issues. And that framework already existed. I didn't ask anybody to write about my piece. It was more like, okay, we're dealing with these issues every day. We don't need someone to explain to me what an exclusive environment at work is. Now let's engage the issues.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I guess in a previous panel there was a lot of talk about comments and hate mail and hostility, and I think it's interesting because when I first started writing, obviously I was very scared of all of that, but also I think that that is not something that's specific to the feminist blogosphere or the blogosphere or the internet or anything. That's just how the world is. That's just what people think. That's just where the problem is. And so I think the last panel pointed out that, you shouldn't worry too much about comments, and comments being really like hateful or trolls because they're proving you right. They're proving your writing right. And I think in the same way, like the process of sort of having all of that negative feedback come to you and then feeling supported, I think that is sort of a microcosm for how the entire feminist blogosphere could be viewed as working, because it happens in public and you get all these negative comments in public or directly into your inbox, and it can feel very personal. But actually it's the farthest thing from personal that you can get. It's someone that you don't know saying something to you on the internet. And I think what happens far more often is that someone does know says that same criticism to someone that they do know in person or face to face or in the most private and intimate moments in a bedroom, in a home. Hateful things are said. And I think what is great about the feminist blogosphere is that these things have been discussed publicly. So when that happens, that person doesn't experience that alone, or doesn't say, someone just told me to my face that they hope that my vagina rots out, and I feel so much shame around that. Maybe they don't feel as much shame around that because they know that someone also told you that, and you,
They see somebody withstand it.
Exactly.
And they also, I also have thousands of supportive emails and comments too.
Right.
And not just supportive, like I can handle it, like I knew what I was getting into, but also, again, like a conversation about the substance of the issues, people coming in and saying, yes, but what about this?
Right. And that's
making me think of things I hadn't thought of before.
Yeah, and I think sometimes people accuse people who are part of the feminist blogosphere as being like gluttons for attention, or it can feel sort of sacrificial to talk about these issues in a public way. I mean, I think a very common critique is that you write about these like very sexy or charged or controversial issues in public for attention, or that it's not the most efficient form of activism. I mean, I think, I personally have questioned this as a career in like different ways, or like thinking about what are my true motivations for having these conversations in a public way, in a way that will follow me and my name for the rest of my life. I'm talking about like sex and blowjobs and my views on really charged issues that will be out there forever as a relatively young person who just graduated from college and doesn't know what she would maybe want to be doing in 10 years. And I think that sacrifice, quote unquote sacrifice, is actually a huge privilege and not in vain. And it's processes like that remind me of that.
And I'm going on with what you're saying about writing about sex. I mean, at 42, it's going to, I'm like, well, my life's kind of, I suppose, and I'm kidding. I'm not saying that in a pejorative sense, because, we can talk about all kinds of life expectancy and all of that, especially being a black woman in the United States. So I'm not saying that facetiously, halfway. But what I am getting at is, what I've noticed is that when we talk about issues that are charged, like sex, like race, in the blogosphere, even when there's blow-ups, which I actually think are a form of activism, as strange as that sounds, as hurtful as it is when it goes down, it is still a form of activism because people are thinking through, people are thinking with the issues that are at hand. Some people aren't thinking at all, they just want to come after you, but you know, those are the haters, those are the assholes, and they kind of go off and do something else amongst themselves. Clusterfuck. Anyway, so, but the thing is, for example, when we were talking about activism, those are kind of the long-term activisms. The conversation itself is the activism. And then sometimes that spills over, I think with racial issues, it tends to spill over into a mainstream situation. I'll give an example. LaToya and Taya Lim, who are, Taya Lim, who's my racial justice cohort, did a analysis of this story that was done in Newsweek. It was about a year ago about the Newsweek women who only received so much, they only received so much pay, they were treated unfairly in the workplace. And the story went back and spoke to a few of the people who were still there and said what was going on. And basically, it was an issue. The story was like really about white women. And LaToya and Taya looked at this and says, this is about white women and who didn't get their promised dream of having it all. And what happened was, LaToya said, I want to talk to the woman the woman of color, her name was Raina Kelly, who was basically said, well, you know, it wasn't our story as women of color, but LaToya and Taya said, but the fact is that women of color didn't join the lawsuit in the first place. That's an interesting piece that was never mentioned. Why was that not mentioned? So it became, so a lot of people who are, we call them racializants, supported us, and then actually some of the writers from Newsweek came on the blog and engaged and said, what are you talking about? I don't understand. We meant this in good faith, and LaToya and Tara said, no, you didn't. This is not what this is about. You were basically talking about white women not getting what you want in life. And this is just one example of how you didn't get it. And how can you exclude the story of women of color who were not even involved, and then want to hand off the issue around race to this black woman? I mean, how are you playing her in this particular situation? So,
and it was a launchpad for a whole issue about women, right? It wasn't just about the lawsuit, but it was also supposed to be about how far women have come generally, right?
Exactly. And how far women did not come generally, because who are you talking about when you talk about
like it used
women?
That story as a universal story. I felt like
yes, pretty much. And that's when LaToya said this is not universal. This is about white women, and we need to be really clear about that. And again, that's when the mainstream media kind of came to us and tried to say, basically try to do this PR thing, what I would call it, and say that, this is what we were doing, and we were saying, no, it's not. So I think it forms we kind of have a kind of a watchdog role, I think, when it comes to that.
That's really interesting. Well, I think you guys have really touched on the fact that taking on big guns works now, and even if they don't initially talk to you, other people who they care about will start talking about you, and then they are, pulled into responding. The other sort of recent, really important and impressive example of this was the More in Me campaign, which I think, Amanda, you were involved in. I don't know if you want to talk about that a bit, and anyone else who was involved in it can jump in, but I think that was another example of talking at someone for a long time before they responded, and it was really only through community persistence and it coming from many voices that there was ever a response.
Well, and it was Sadie Doyle who started the More in Me hashtag, and
do you want to give context for what it was?
Yeah, what happened was Julian Assange, she's the founder of WikiLeaks, has been accused by 2 Swedish women of rape. Invariably, when I've actually in all the years I've been writing about the subject, never seen a rape case where the victims weren't blamed, accused of lying or something like, and I say that like the most recent example being the Cleveland, Texas situation where it's an 11-year-old girl and she was blamed in a gang rape situation. So, I mean, none of us were exactly surprised to see Julian Assange defended by a number of men, both left and right, who accused the alleged victims in this case of just basically being hysterical and liars. It was a little surprising, however, when we saw Michael Moore join the pile-on. Yeah. And he went on Keith Olbermann and he basically accused the accusers of blowing something out of proportion. And everyone was furious.
And laughed about called it hooey.
Hooey, that was the word.
Yeah, hooey. Yeah. And so Sadie made the really good point, like with the racial issue situation, one of the things that people didn't have in the past was the ability to just be an irritant. And now you can be an irritant because everybody's online and it's not the great equalizer, but it's equalizing. And so everybody just started tweeting Michael Moore and tweeting Keith Olbermann, and Keith apparently has like the thinnest skin imaginable because he immediately got into it on Twitter. But in a way, it was good that Keith Olbermann started to respond because then people were like, no, they really are reading this. They really are listening. So
spam bots.
Yeah. But also, didn't Keith Olbermann flounce off? He like quit Twitter for a minute because you guys totally found.
Yeah, he quit. He came back. He did the internet flounce. I've seen many trolls do this for many years. That's it, I'm leaving. 5 minutes later, one more thing.
Pretty much.
And, Michael Moore had a lot more dignity than that. But he did respond. He went on Rachel Maddow's show, and he didn't mention Moore and me, and he didn't mention that was the name of the hashtag that everyone was using to kind of, if you're not on Twitter, what you can do is create a hashtag which creates its own feed that you can follow so you can see everybody jumping in. But he walked it back and he said that, my progressivism is one essentially that is not going to be anti-feminist even when it's convenient. And so I was really happy about that. I was lucky to be in the audience when he did that, so I was thrilled. I was tweeting away. But I think, it's something I've seen in the years that I've been doing this. A lot of the time, like you said, like there will be an initial, anger and hostility, and then people will sort of absorb the ideas and the criticisms, and then they will change. And I've definitely been the kind of on the receiving end of that in my life, and people do change, and it's a remarkable thing to see, and it gives you a lot of hope. But I don't think you would be able to do that if you didn't have the internet and you didn't have the community that it provides.
And the scale. Oh, one really quick thing to add is that in the case of that Cleveland, Texas case, this morning, I guess, or maybe it went online last night, Bill Keller has a column in the Times Magazine, the executive editor of the New York Times, and he mentioned the Cleveland, Texas story, this 11-year-old gang rape victim that was blamed, and he said something about how it was a general story about the Times News gathering and how they don't always get it right, and he said, and what their principles are for reporting, and there was a line in it in which he said it was a ham-handed story, and the only way to make amends was to order a new story. But they have not, as far as I can tell, and no one else can find another story that they've written, and that's definitely baby steps. I mean, I immediately tweeted and being like, that's the only way to make amends. Like, if you think it was a terrible piece, why don't you say so? What about an editor's note? But that was something that, I woke up in the morning and I had 15 emails from people who had independently read that story, recognized victim blaming when they saw it, sent out an there was a change.org petition that had 40,000 signatures last I checked. That was an example of a lot of different people coming together and saying, here's an example of this thing that exists in our society that is being promulgated by the New York Times. And so that's baby steps. I think that that's a little bit short of an apology, but he has to at least acknowledge it.
It makes me think too, because of your writing on the situation. With the Daily Show thing, you actually could see how the internet can cause people to be too simplistic, but it also, because you can write infinitely on the internet, it also allows people to be nuanced. I think in a kind of pre-blogger day, like, it would have been very difficult to react to the Cleveland, Texas story in a nuanced way, because it would have had to been a short, sweet letter to the editor at best. Whereas I've seen people really kind of struggle with, you know, the geography, the race issues, the sort of, you know, the history of this kind of community, and like where some of this is coming from, and why and why it's not as simple as could be packed into 2 paragraphs and sent to the New York Times, you know, in the letters to the editors.
I just wanted to go back to something you said, because you mentioned the internet as being not an equalizer, but equalizing. And I just wanted to pick up on that, because I think that's true to an extent, but I also would be remiss if I didn't say here that I see it as an issue of capacity, and I see it as a privilege. Yes. And I think that, you know, my day job and my non-day job activities on feministing and the griot sort of all intersect in a way that allows me to do this work, right? So I blog during the day, and then I can sort of tie all these activities together, but I definitely see it as a privilege, and I think we're at this huge sort of like place, right, that I think you set up really nicely at the beginning of our panel with this thing that we're calling in this room the Feminist Blogosphere, but I don't even know if it's to be called that. I think it's a resurgence of female journalism that's happening online around, you know, a grouping of issues that can loosely be tied together through social justice related ties. But so, yeah, we'll make that definition longer. But so I think we're at this place, right? And I think for a long time the feminist blogosphere, I'm using quotes now, was just sort of like this open frontier and just unconquered, and you just like, you know, cowboys like ride in and stake your land and do your thing. And I think we're so not there anymore, and it's just really interesting to see what will happen next. I mean, I think like the presence of you on this panel is really amazing and offers this different take on it, because you know, the Gawker media conglomerate is certainly not, you know, you wouldn't think of it as like this place for activism, and I think of myself as like an activist first, and like blogging as a means to my activism. And like how, like, you know,
right, I think of myself as a journalist.
Right, and like so, but we're both doing like similar work, and we're both like
we work together,
and we want to support each other's work. And I think, you know, that I'm really curious and like maybe a little bit scared or just hesitant about like how the continued corporatization of these spaces will, what effect that will have on the content that's happening, and I just wanted to raise that. When you
well,
said
according to the New York Times, the only blog is shut down. So we'll be fine.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
That's settled.
Clearly, there's some. I mean, I don't even know. Like, there must just not be female journalists. Like, I wouldn't even know where to find them. Like, do you Google them? I mean, is there like a Tumblr thing? Well, I mean, and we should point out the great work of Anne Friedman and who has put together a Tumblr called Lady Journos, which has the amazing work in many different fields of women journalists. So when I say is there a Tumblr for that, there is one.
There's somebody.
This also feels like it had been written about 5 years ago.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, I blogged about it, and I said, New York Times 2006 called, they want their narrative back. I mean, really.
What's the next step? You know, what's beyond the op-ed pages of this establishment journalistic, you know, sort of private company that we place so much stock in, and that does have so much social responsibility, and we know its importance, but you know, is there a way for us to sort of take back some of the power that they have in who they're choosing? I mean, it's not like they're, you know, elected representatives. I really believe that, you know, we can empower our own spaces as much as we should be engaging in that.
And that's exactly, Lori, and that's I think I was thinking about is, and this is going to sound very crass, but it's like, who exactly is the New York Times anymore? I mean, they're coming to they're coming over to our side,
Yeah.
They're trying to find stories online from the blogs, from the bloggers, from the tweets about what they should be doing next. I mean, there have been, wasn't there some kind of huge, not a lawsuit, there's a big kerfuffle about a couple of New York Times writers, editors, taking stuff from the blogosphere and not crediting, and not citing their sources, or citing the people where they got this information from, or even got the story from. And so, I think, and I'm sure we've discussed it before, there's this shifting idea of what is media anymore, and who is media, and who are the media makers, and who are the opinion makers, and who are the, who's who anymore? I mean, I think even Maureen O'Dowd kind of went to a snit about how dare those upstart bloggers and tweeters take over my domain as, not lady, but as opinion maker over here at the New York Times. I'm the one that has been crowned this. How dare you people over there do that?
Well, she's always it's funny because I was actually going to say the opposite. I mean, I think what you guys are saying is very true, and yet I was going to point out an example of Anna Holmes, who a couple of weeks ago wrote an op-ed, it's not the same as a column, obviously, but it's the same space, about Charlie Sheen and violence against women and how we feel about sex workers. And once again, everyone in this room had probably already been writing about it, was pretty aware of those issues, but it was the #2 most emailed piece, I think. And I just think this is an example where there was an editor there who was interested in showcasing this. He asked her to write it. She did an amazing job at it. She distilled it in a way that, was sharp and effective. And she's a woman of color writing on the op-ed page in a place where there just aren't any. There haven't been any. And so to see that go up the most emailed list of the New York Times, it's just a question of scale, right? It's not the only place. And part of it is that, a lot of these voices she started her own space, right? I mean, it was within a corporate framework, but she started it, and she developed all of these ideas in tandem with these communities, right? They were informed by them, and yet, somebody's dad read that. Somebody's dad who does not think about sex workers as people who don't deserve to be abused, read that piece in the New York Times, and they wouldn't go to Jezebel, and they wouldn't go to Racialicious because they don't need to. They feel like they don't need to. And hopefully that's a place for them to start and say, oh, what is this site? And maybe I'm going to find another site through it. So I think it's hard to underestimate that scale. They're still very, very
I
powerful.
think it's a both and situation.
Yes.
I mean, we need both our spaces, and we need outreach, and we can do both. And we clearly are accomplishing that.
Right.
And not to be trite.
Let's try it all. But again, where was Anna Holmes before she went to New York Times?
Yeah, no, and I think that's one thing blogs can do is help get people who have no other path into mainstream media. It's one of our main functions.
Exactly. But I think we also need to talk about, even though I think it's getting small, we need to talk about broader ideas of access and whose voice gets heard and for what reason as well. Anna Holmes, woman of color, New York Times, but she had to basically start her own media company in order to even get to the point of the New York Times.
Right.
What about those people who, especially with net neutrality coming in and things like that, what voices are getting heard and not heard, and in this shifting space? And I think Latoya herself wrote a piece not too long ago about who gets heard even in feminist blogospheres. What is the profile of the person who gets heard in the feminist blogosphere? White, female, cisgender, certain education. I think she said like atheist, agnostic. So there's a whole profile, and she says, even though I have some of these privileges and some of these advantages, I still don't fit in other ones. And how does that put me, even though I do what I do, and I'm compensated and I'm known for what I do, how does that look when it comes even into the feminist blogosphere? What does that even look like? So we gotta kind of put that into context as well when we talk about feminist blogosphere and access and who gets heard and who doesn't get heard.
Yeah, I think it seems clear that that's not left to their own devices, a lot of these big institutions are just not going to do it, right? I mean, it has to do with like having these voices be very strong in their own spaces and then pushing them. I mean, pushing at them in kinds of the ways that we've been describing and maybe ones we haven't thought of.
And not being grateful for the dribbles that we get, I think.
Yeah.
Because it is true, like, as you were saying, you know, a handful of people become the figureheads of any kind of sphere of anything on the internet, and they are inevitably the most privileged members of the group, even if the larger group is more diverse than the few figureheads are.
But so it goes in both directions, right? So we want to think about whose voices get privileged in the feminist blogosphere to go on to a New York Times, but we also want to think about our own sites as platforms for those who might not be as privileged as we are to get their stories told. So I think I told this story on another panel that I was on with you last week, but I want to share it again because I think it's a good example of like sort of where we're going in this and like the transnational thing that's happening. So you guys have heard of like these Vice documentaries. Vice does these, like Vice will go into
Vice magazine.
Yeah, they'll like go travel internationally, go somewhere, make a documentary about an issue, and they're pretty popular, like breakdowns of different issues around the world, right? So they made a documentary called Prostitutes of God, and it was about a sex worker community in India that they portrayed as prostitutes who work in the name of religion. And in the video, they made a number of human rights violations, including outing a 15-year-old sex worker as HIV positive without her permission, showing her face on screen. And you know, they just released this documentary and thought that that would be the end of it. They spent, I think, about a week in the community where this was filmed. And you know, so a day goes by, they release the film, and it just so happens that the organization that I work with, the International Women's Health Coalition, we partner with the organization of sex worker organizers that they talked to, and we happened to find out that they had seen this documentary that Vice made, and they were incredibly enraged by it and upset by it, and felt that their images had been misrepresented. And we've done communications trainings with them, and so they just went ahead and they made a response documentary. And so they decided to take the media into their own hands and make this video and talk about how their views have been misrepresented, their rights have been violated, their confidentiality had been violated, their trust had been violated, and they set the record straight on a number of levels. And it was a very passionate video, and to this day, when you look up the video, the response video is the first result that comes up. And so, you know, part of this whole process is like it's a give and take and it's multi-directional. It's not, you know, just trying to promote our own views and you know, sort of get them out to bigger audiences, but it's also just being a platform for people whose voices are not heard or who are used to being spoken for in these arenas, and the time is over for that. We speak for ourselves now.
And I actually, just to build on that, I think it's also been an amazing thing for people who don't necessarily live in New York and don't know media people who are great writers to get out there. I mean, we have actually hired 2 of our commenters. Gawker has hired at least one of them, but you know, we have had a couple people just leave stellar comments. I mean, I don't know, sometimes it's shaming when the comments are better than the articles, but then you're happy that they're there. And you know, we've hired them to be weekend writers, and one of them who writes under the name Morning Glory, I mean, she works in finance. She's a full-time job in finance, and she's like a comment moderator during the week, and on the weekend she writes pop posts that are incredibly popular. She's really funny, and it was just like she was leaving comments on everything, being hilarious. And you know, she happens to come from a relatively privileged background, but nonetheless, she lives in another city that's not New York. We've never met her in person. She's just great. She just proved herself in the space.
Well, that was certainly what happened for me. I mean, I grew up in Texas. I didn't know media people or have even the first inkling or clue of how to get a media job. None. Zero. No one ever told me that. No one ever, like, it never even occurred to me that was something possible for me. I was blogging just for the hell of it. I mean, truly for the hell of it. And shows what, yeah. Now I'm in New York.
I mean, I think that's how, that's when I moved with Toya. She's in DC. And the couple people that she says, well, I will not use the word that she used, but the people that she recruited to be part of Racialicious, one is, I think they're both Canadians. And we have since laid eyes on each other. But, well, some of us have laid eyes on each other. None of us have, we as racialists, I think we have not met Arturo, and I have yet to meet Taya, and I have yet to meet Jessica. But Jessica and Taya are Canadians. Jessica is everywhere. And Taya is now working on her master's thesis in Texas. So, but here we all are, it's usually some of the backstage stories that we tell each other, but we've never met. But yet these are people who have incredible voices on our blogs, and that's kind of that's how it works anymore.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think it's interesting too to consider how much feminist blogging just has been able to do that for people, create a community of like-minded people. And some of the best friendships I have in the world are people I barely ever see.
Yeah.
But you're talking all day. You're kind of hashing out the issues.
Yeah.
By the time I wake up and look at my Twitter stream, I have all of these ideas that I want to think about, and I want to hear what people have to say about them, and forming an opinion that way in this kind of discursive way. And there's some people in this room that I know way better from Twitter than I know in person. So hi guys, nice to hear you. Nice to see you.
My co-blogger Jessie Taylor and I did not actually meet in person until we'd been working together for 2 years.
Yeah. And when I went to Racial Issues, I literally did not meet I didn't know that Carmen literally lived down the street from me.
Wow.
And I think one day I said something where I lived, and said, wait, you live there? So do I. Who knew? So it does have that privilege, does have that advantage, the online world.
So I think we have time for probably one more question. I have a question if no one else does, but I bet someone does. No. Okay.
Everybody's eating. There's
we
no
can
digesting.
close with something you learned about feminism from blogging that you would not have learned from feminism in real life.
Yeah, this is my idea for a question. Sorry, guys. But I don't even really have an answer.
Oh, okay.
No, my answer quickly is that, for me, it's just also being drawn back into, something that I learned is being a journalist with an activist role or an activist interest at the same time is possible. And that's partly due to people who have been in the field from the beginning. I pretty much was not very involved in activism in college, was much more active in journalist stuff. But my first job was as an intern at Ms. I cold emailed them. I didn't know anyone. I just asked if I could spend career day there when I was in high school. And so, and they happened to answer the email. So I always was really interested in feminism, but I just thought that it was like, I went to a pro-choice march, and a journalist who was a mentor to me told me, you have to stop doing that. Because if you want to be a journalist, that's it. And there's a lot of people every day proving him wrong, and I'm happy to join their ranks. Proving him wrong. Sorry.
I think one of the biggest things, probably the most impactful on me, was learning how many people out there are thinking about these issues in depth and how important it is to so many people. Because certainly when I started blogging, part of the reason I did was I felt so isolated, even in Austin, which is like the most liberal part of Texas. Everyone's a Democrat, everyone's ostensibly liberal, but it's just fairly conservative there. My sort of radical view of feminism was not something people around me cared much about, and so I literally thought I was just gonna be ranting into the atmosphere and no one cared. And I've instead found that there are people all over the country of different ages, races, income levels, whatever, and they all are thinking about these things in these ways, and they're so interesting and so insightful, and it's been tremendous.
I would say that my words can stand alone, and that they have power, and that they can change tangible things.
What did I learn about that? Wow. That the fault lines that have been with every other wave are still there in a lot of ways. At the same time, we are, I think thanks to the internet, we're able to work through and I don't want to say pave over, but we are able to work through some of those fault lines, whereas before it was just kind of always there and it kind of got passed on into the next generation. I think this generation of feminists are able to talk back, talk to each other, talk through, still get into blow-ups here and there, but still are trying to work on it in a very, very active way that I think maybe wasn't there before.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, thank you guys all for this amazing conversation. I'm so thrilled you were able to join us, and I'm excited already to watch the video of this because I just want to reabsorb an amazing snapshot of where the feminist blogosphere and beyond, as Lori has called us to think about, is at this moment and will be for some months to come. So thank you so much.